All right, good morning, Mr. Sapora here. So this week we're going to be talking about seabirds and the weekly questions I will post on Google Classroom. So you'll see those there. There's 2 pages, front and back, and there's also some required reading from the textbook this week. So that's right there, highlight in beautiful blue. Not a lot for you to read, but anyway, check that out as well. And all of that will be posted right here under week 4. Seabirds here in our Google Classroom. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this party started. This week brought to you by Marine Biology. Slides 35 through 42, basically 43 is just an added image layer, is what we'll be taking notes on this week and covering. I'm considering extending this for 2 weeks and adding another presentation about seabirds and some added information, maybe a video with the Google form to fill out as well. We'll see where we land with this more towards the end of the week when we get to Friday's quiz, because there is a lot to cover here. So let's just go ahead and get this started, shall we? All right. Seabirds. I apologize for my fonting up here at the top. It's a little sloppy there. Okay, so just an overview of seabirds and birds in general. So birds are a type of vertebrate, right? There's 7 different classes of vertebrates. Vertebrates are a phylum within the animal kingdom. So the different classes of vertebrates, we've covered some of them, 2 of them so far, and previously, and that would be agnathans and chondrichthyes, right? So lampreys, hagfish, sharks. Then we're going to get into bony fish. I'm kind of jumping around here a little bit because I can. And then other classes of vertebrates are ones we're very familiar with because they occur on land. Those would be amphibians, reptiles, birds, and then mammals. Those are the 7 different classes of birds. Birds as a class evolved from reptiles. So they have a lot of reptilian features. So it's just scales and claws and solid eggs and things like that. They evolved specifically from a group of dinosaurs, the raptors. And there's many different lineages of dinosaurs, different groups of them, all of which are extinct, but birds are the only one that still exists today. And looking back in the fossil record, we find evidence that birds, really bird-like features, dinosaurs with bird-like features started around 150 to even 200 million years ago. So the more we look, the more we find. We find feathered dinosaurs commonly in the fossil record. We find dinosaurs with claws. We find, birds, feathered dinosaurs with claws that still stick out, like a thumb sticking out of where the wing is. Tails, right? Tail bones with feathers on them. Birds don't have tails. They have tail feathers, but their vertebrae stop right at their hip. And teeth as well. This image shows. So the early birds were really, half bird, half reptile. There's transitions along the way as we go. Birds today don't have any teeth. They have a bill, and they all share some features in common. But these were basically running around. Chickens with teeth and claws, dinosaurs with feathers, however you want to cut it. Fossil evidence indicates that birds first moved into the oceans, or we started seeing seabirds around 60 million years ago. So there's quite a bit of time here, maybe 100 million years, before we start to see evidence that these feathered raptors made their way into the ocean. At the same time, we find fossils also of whales. It doesn't mean that there's any direct correlation there. It's just that this area of the world where we find these fossils, it's around Pakistan. If you look at Google Earth, you'll look down and you can actually see where India meets Pakistan on the west end of India, all these sedimentary rocks that are really wrinkled and folded up and exposed. Because it's a very arid area and because it's been uplifted by the collision of India, we have a really good fossil record from that region. There's probably other areas where all this was going on, but we just don't have good enough fossils. But in that area we do, so we have a good lens into what was happening at this 60 million year old window. And we see a lot of evidence that we find evidence of seabirds and things like that, transitional forms. Worldwide today, there's 280 species of seabird that exist in the world today. Pretty cool. And here off the Oregon coast, this is a real rough number, a real estimate. There's about 400,000 seabirds that breed along the Oregon coast. on our sea stacks and islands, and this is we'll talk a little bit more about where they breed probably later. But that number's probably low for what Oregon historically had, but humans have had a large impact on seabirds because they spend most of their life at ocean, and when they come in to nest, they just literally sit down on the grass or on a rock ledge on some of these coastal islands. And anything that we've done to these really limited habitats, even just encroaching on them with boats and things, has had an impact in the past. People have hunted them for sport in the past because it's fun to shoot things. I don't know. And then, fisheries and things like that have had a big impact on them too. Kind of a bummer. Okay, there are different groups of seabirds. So the first group, well, there's different ways of classifying them. There are really two. What we call primary seabirds. These are birds that are seabirds. They spend their whole life at sea. They get all their food from the ocean. They're 100% dependent on the ocean. Versus what you'll see later, secondary seabirds. These are birds that part of their life is in the ocean, but part of it is back on land or somewhere tied to land where they get their food or where they nest or whatever. So again, seabirds obtain all their food entirely from the ocean, and they get that food through a variety of ways. We'll be talking about this later: flying, swimming, or diving. Swimming along the surface, diving underwater, or just flying and grabbing stuff off the surface of the ocean. There's a number of ways to do that. And there are 4 different orders of seabird. So if you remember before, we have life, then we have 2 divisions of life based on cell types, right? Prokaryote and eukaryote. And then underneath that, we have the kingdoms of life, right? There's 2 kingdoms in prokaryote, and there's 4 kingdoms in eukaryote. We're familiar with the eukaryotes because they're us. You are a eukaryote. There's animals, there's plants, there's fungus, and there's these protistas, which consist of many single-celled things and algae. Underneath the kingdoms, then, we have phylums, and we've talked about that. So in the animal kingdom, you have phylums, right? We're in the vertebrate phylum. Underneath phylum Chordata, underneath phylums, then you're going to have different classes, and we just talked about that before. So then now we're talking about classes. We've got mammals, amphibians, chondrichthyes, right, etc. And in this case, we have aves, birds. Underneath the classes, then you have orders, and so there's different orders of birds out there. Examples would be things like ducks and geese, or hawks and raptors, or songbirds, or hummingbirds, or woodpeckers, if you will. And then there's actually 4 different groups of seabirds. So birds have evolved currently. The seabirds we have really evolved independently 4 different ways, right? Birds have gone to water in 4 different ways because they're not directly related. The first group is the most popular and famous one around the world, penguins. When we think of a bird that lives in the ocean, and penguin is the first thing that pops. There's 18 species worldwide. Here's that little picture of all 18. Ain't they cute? And these 18 species of penguin all exist in the southern hemisphere. So no penguins breed north of the equator, interestingly enough. One species breeds on the equator, and that is the Galapagos penguin, little tiny one. And then the rest of them are all southern hemisphere, either South America, Antarctica, Africa, South Africa, Australia, those areas. Many islands throughout the southern hemisphere. We don't have any up here, so we don't really, I'm not going to focus on them much. Okay. Worldwide, there's a group of seabirds called tube noses, and tube noses, Procellaria formis is the specific name of that group. It consists of albatrosses and petrels. Albatross is the largest bird existing in the world today. When they stand, just, or tail to nose, they're 3.5, 4 feet. So they would literally stand, up to your ribs standing. And they have up to 12-foot wingspan on these suckers. So they're just massive, massive, massive birds. And they can fly for days and weeks on end without flapping. They just glide into the wind and soar. They're the greatest soaring bird on the planet today. And they have special adaptations for life at sea. They got these little tube noses right here. Here's a baby petrel. Petrels are a much smaller version. Instead of, they still glide. They're very light bodied with big wings. They kind of fly right along the surface and walk along the surface of the ocean and feed on plankton with their little hooked bill. So tube noses, they have these specialized tubes, and all of them have it, and they have other features in common, showing their relationships to each other. Next group of primary seabirds that contains primary seabirds at least would be pelicaniformes, pelicans, and cormorants. So pelicans can be secondary seabirds, mainly are. Some of their life along the shore and ocean, or primary, I guess in that sense. But when we think of real primary seabirds, there are many cormorants that are. Cormorants are related to pelicans. They're in a little, their own little group there. And they have features in common. They have a long neck with a pouch underneath. And they all, of pelicaniformes, share one feature in common, which is kind of cool. And it's this webbed foot that they have. It's not that they have a webbed foot, it's how it's webbed. So all of the birds with webbed feet have 3 toes that are webbed. 3 toes that are webbed. And the webbing sits in between the toes, so they have 2 webs. And then they have a little thumb that just sits at the back that's separate, or, pretty reduced in size. The pelicaniformes have 4 webbed toes, 3 webs in between, so their thumb is rotated forward and is webbed. That is a distinguishing characteristic of this particular order of bird. So literally you can find a dead bird on a beach, just a few bones or a leg bone, and usually this webbing is still there. It's kind of leathery, and you can pick it up and you can tell if it's in this group or not. Kind of a fun trick I like to do when I'm with my friends at the beach and they think I'm gross. So what? Next group of seabirds out there is the charadriiformes. That's a mouthful. Charadriiformes, or charadriiforms, as they are commonly called. Charads, I guess. Why not? This is our biggest group in the northern hemisphere of seabirds. It consists of gulls, right? So there's a lot of different varieties of gulls worldwide. Terns, which are closely related to gulls. Here's a picture I took of an Arctic tern up in the Arctic. And they're very gull-like, but they have sleeker, pointier wings. They're a little more agile flyers. And these birds, a little lighter bodied, they actually dive and plunge dive and catch things that way. And auks. Auks is a huge group. So you're talking murres and puffins and what we call the auklets. So I have a picture of each of those here. Down here we have the crested auklet. And this is a cute little robin-sized, blue jay-sized seabird that dives and catches plankton. And they nest in colonies of millions on volcanic slopes of islands throughout Alaska. This is a picture I took of working with one in Bull Deer Island, which is pretty far out in the Aleutians near Russia. I worked on a colony there that had close to 1 million crested auklets breeding in it at one time. It's like bees in a hive. It's crazy. They dive down and they catch copepods and things like that down in the ocean. Pretty amazing little birds. This is the tufted puffin, also a type of charadriiform auk in that group. Both of these birds are diving birds. What the auks are the most penguin-like of the other orders of seabirds. They are specialists in diving. They can still fly, but they don't do it very well, and they use their wings underwater like penguins do. So tufted puffin uses its wings underwater, has this big, large bill, uses it to catch squid and small bait fish. And then the murres. These are really your quintessential auk. This is a thick-billed murre. I took this as well up in Alaska. These birds can dive down to 600 feet deep, hold their breath for almost 4 minutes. They're just an amazing, amazing seabird, and very much like a penguin. I mean, they look very much like a penguin, behave like a penguin. That's a great example of what we call convergent evolution. 2 different orders arriving at the same form because they do the same job. So nature shapes populations of organisms over time, and that's a good example of that. Secondary seabirds include things like ducks and sandpipers. These are birds that spend part of their life in the ocean, but then part of their life they will spend it in a pond, in a lake, in a river, somewhere inland where they nest or breed primarily. That's the reason why they do that. We have sea ducks here, ducks that surf scoters and things that are out in the ocean. They're primary seabirds half the year, but then the other half they fly into lakes and ponds to nest. So takes them out of the running for the primary status. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about adaptations to life at sea. So how do these birds, what makes them special at being a seabird? What makes a seabird a seabird? And especially this group of birds have a really unique set of adaptations because life at sea is so different from life at land, especially for a bird. So there's some things they need to overcome and adapt to. and they share some things in common. One of them is that seabirds have a saltwater gland, usually located in their nasal cavity. In the case of the procellarians or the tube noses, they have it right up between the eyes. They have two of them, and they are little kidney-like organs that will pull salt out of the blood, and then it'll squirt it out of their nose. So they eat food that's really high in salt, and this food has water in it, right? So they're drinking water straight from the ocean, I guess, but primarily I think probably extract it from the food that they eat. But then it makes their blood really salty to a level that these organisms are detrimental to their health. So then they have blood runs up through this gland, and through basically countercurrent exchange, osmosis, they will pull that out of their blood salt, and it will run into this nasal cavity, a set of ducts, and then it'll leak out their nose and drip. And tube noses have special grooves as well to run the salt down so it doesn't blow back into their eyes. Kind of cool. All four groups of seabirds have this adaptation, but it's not the same in all fours. It's similar. So another example of convergent evolution. They've all arrived at a similar style of adaptation to deal with this problem. Okay, in tube noses, ridges on top of the bill direct the salt away. And another adaptation is that the bill shape, morphology means form or shape, differs greatly depending on the food source. So there's a variety of food sources in the ocean. It's not just fish. In fact, if you want to, think about energy pyramids and stuff, fish would be near the top, so there'd be fewer of them. So your seabirds that exist in huge numbers, I think I showed you the crested auklet before, saying they nest in the millions or hundreds of thousands. There's so many of them because they feed lower down in the energy pyramid, lower in the food chain where there's more food. They feed on copepods, which there's a lot more of. And then fish and other things feed on copepods. So it's going to be fewer of them, and then if you feed on those fish, there's going to be fewer of you. So it's just a numbers game there. So birds have to have adapted to feed on this variety of food sources that exist in the ocean, not just fish. Cormorants are fish specialists, and they dive, and with their long bill, they got a hooky point on the end. They're really fast underwater. They got this long neck, and they can snatch little tiny bait fish or even big fish. I've seen these things swallow some pretty large rockfish in my day. They'll grab these things and swallow them down, usually carry them up to the surface and flip them back. Speaking of feeding in a weird place in the food chain, the parakeet auklet, which is a larger size auklet, in between a crested auklet and a puffin, let's say, have a bill that is hooked on the bottom upwards, and it has a sharp point on it where they will stab jellyfish and rip out parts of them, or eat small jellyfish, but they can poke and stab with them so they don't slip away. Imagine trying to take a bite out of jellyfish in water. Good luck. They're specialized and adapted at that. And then puffins have really cool bill morphology. They have little tiny hooks on the underside of their mouth, inside their mouth, that point backwards. And so their adaptation is to be able to hold more than one fish in their mouth at a time, or squid. So when they dive down, they grab one squid, especially if they need to take it back to the nest, to their baby. That is a difficult, to hold more than one time would be difficult. To open your mouth while you still had one in there that you were holding, the other might slide out as you were trying to grab another one. So they have these little hooks, and they can take their tongue, hold it to the roof of their mouth, and slow move la face. Try holding your tongue to the roof of your mouth and moving your jaw still up and down. You can do it. And those little projections help them keep the squid or the fish from in their mouth while they are still moving their bill. Neat, right? Okay. Tube noses convert food into in their stomachs to concentrate oil to feed young. So another adaptation is if you have to cover a large area like the albatross does because they soar, they're often feeding right off the surface, and they're covering huge areas as they're flying around the ocean for days and weeks on end. They're like the vultures of the sea that kind of just cruise around looking for stuff to scavenge. If they had a baby back at the nest, which they do, they leave their chicks for days, or even sometimes up to 10 days or more on the nest while they're out foraging, they need to come back with something substantial. They can't just fly back after 10 days with one fish that's kind of half dried up and feed it to their young. That would be terrible. So what they do is, while they're out there feeding, everything they eat, they concentrate into this really super calorie rich oil. It's like orange motor oil or something, cooking oil, if you will. And when they come back to the nest to feed their young, they have this stomach full of this really high calorie oil that they then vomit into the baby's mouth, and the baby drinks that. And it's, it's superfood. It's some kind of massive, weight gaining protein shake version of the bird world for their chicks. Recent studies, I mean in the last, 15 years or so, there's been some books written on it. Eye of the Albatross came out probably 10 years ago or more. They put transmitters on the albatross, and they nest in Hawaii where it's warm. And while it's beautiful, to look at, the ocean there is pretty clear, which means there's not a lot of life in it overall. It's pretty barren. It's kind of like a desert. And life is concentrated in the reefs, but they're tiny things, and they're hard to get to for a bird. So albatross were seen up in Alaska in the summer, and they were like, well, what are they doing up here? I thought they were nesting down south with their chicks. And they found out that the albatross will nest down there. Once the chick hatches, they will fly up to 3 days straight, 1,500 miles one way up to Alaska, to the waters of the North Pacific, feed, eat a bunch of food, fly back. And it's a 10-day round-trip journey sometimes. And then all that food they gathered up in Alaska, they'll concentrate into oil, and they'll fly back and puke that oil into their baby's mouth. Pretty neat. Pretty neat. Okay. Here's a picture of a baby tube nose. Get out of here. Picture of a baby tube nose. This is a young storm petrel right here. That little nose, those nasal holes. They're so cute. Petrels. This is me holding one. This was up in Alaska as well. This is a baby fork-tailed storm petrel. Okay, let's keep going here. And here's a picture of a fulmar, another type of tube-nosed bird. You can see the little tube right on top here. I've worked with these up in Alaska as well. We have them here. They're out there in the ocean. We just never see them because they're out further than the shore. You have to be in a fishing boat or get on a charter boat to go out and see them. They're out there cruising all the time, and they squirt out this oil too. And it's a defense strategy to keep predators away. They'll actually puke on them and cover them in oil. Cool. Okay, flight, to fly or swim. In the ocean, seabirds kind of fall into two categories. You're either really good at flying, and you're specially adapted at that, or you're really good at swimming and diving. And there's none that do both very well. So if you're a flying bird, here's some of your adaptations. Long wings for soaring, so long, narrow wings. The albatross and shearwaters have this. They can glide for days to weeks on end without flapping a single time. They have a 12-foot wingspan, and because it's windy out in the ocean, they can turn and kind of bank into the wind as they're flying, and then the wind will lift them up, and then they'll turn and descend slowly at an angle, and then they'll turn back into the wind where it'll lift them up. And they'll keep doing this sort of lift up, drop down motion without ever having to flap. And they can cover hundreds or even thousands of miles that way. Glide for days and weeks without flapping. And these birds feed primarily on the surface. They also have a really good sense of smell. Like I said before, they're the buzzards or the vultures of the sea. They fly around scavenging, and when they do find food, they're what they call surface seizers. They'll land on the surface. Here's an albatross. This is a shearwater, I believe. And they'll land on the surface and then eat, so they have to cover huge areas. Don't want to burn too many calories doing that. Water bats, or petrels, also a type of tube nose. They have another flying adaptation. They would walk along the surface, flapping their wings. They have large wings to their body size, and they're very, very light and dainty little birds. These are Leach's storm petrels. There's a picture of me holding a Leach's storm petrel up in Alaska, working with and banding them. These tiny birds can live an incredibly long time, and most of their life they're out in the ocean, actually feeding at night, where they feed on zooplankton. We read about, I believe, vertical migration here when we talked about plankton, how the zooplankton rise up at night in the ocean to feed on the phytoplankton, and then during the day, the zooplankton will descend down to the dark depths where they're safer from predators. And so because they rise up at night, these leeches storm petrels take advantage of that, flying along at night and just grabbing them off the surface with their pointy little bill hook. So they eat copepods. Kind of neat. Their Latin name is Hydrobatidae, meaning water bat, because they come out at night and feed like bats do. Big fan of bats here in the age of COVID-19. Just kidding. They get a bad rap. We're the ones that were eating them. Okay. Okay, another adaptation then. If you're not going to fly, you're going to dive. And diving birds have some cool, amazing adaptations. Let's look at those. So diving wings are narrow and pointed. So underwater, if you look at a mer's wings, you'll see that they're pretty narrow, especially for their body size, right? Their body's much bigger than their wings. You got narrow pointed wings. In the case of a cormorant, they don't use their wings underwater. They hold them behind their backs, kind of like a free diver would, and just use their feet. But for the auks, mers, puffins, auklets, they use their wings underwater. Because they are really good underwater and they can use them, they're not that good at flying. For their body size, these are small wings. And so mers, when they're flying, they have to, and puffins, like you can see in this picture here, to take off, they have to really get going. It takes them sometimes 100 feet of just what they call taxiing across the water. Kind of like a big jumbo jet needs a big runway. Same thing with these birds. So they have a lot of runway. When they do get going, they fly really fast and flap their wings continuously. And when they go to land, they actually, in this picture here, you can see it, they have to go into the cliff, turn vertical, and kind of lose speed as they kind of go up, and then they start to fall and kind of land on the cliff. It's very clumsy. They'll often miss where they're supposed to land, jump off, fly out to the ocean, turn around, try it again. Pretty fun to watch, actually. Kind of embarrassing for them. Diving birds in the ocean, as well as having specially adapted wings for diving, store large amounts of oxygen in their blood. And they have a modified form of hemoglobin. It's called myoglobin. It's different enough. They've given it its own name. Hemoglobin is a protein that occurs in vertebrates. It's one of our distinguishing characteristics that we share as a group. But theirs is myoglobin. So it stores oxygen a little more densely than hemoglobin does. They'll slow their heart rate down. So they'll almost go into like a resting mode, get very zen as they're down there diving. If they run out of oxygen, they'll switch to anaerobic respiration. That's a non-oxygen form of cellular respiration, or respiration. And it doesn't use oxygen. It's not as efficient, but they can do it in their muscles and organs and things like that in a pinch. They'll divert blood flow from peripheral organ systems or organs that are not essential to the function of diving specifically. So they'll cut blood off to their stomach or to whatever other organs that are not in the moment essential to the act of diving or surviving, which is kind of a cool thing. We kind of do that when we go into fight or flight, right? If you get really startled, your blood shifts away from your stomach, it goes to your muscles, it goes to your nerves and your senses, and your eyes dilate, things like that. They have specialized feathers. Their outer feathers are very well oiled. Their inner feathers underneath trap warm air. So they have this layer of really dense downy feathers, very, very, very dense, soft insulating down feathers. And then over top they have cover feathers that are much tougher, and they oil them continuously. A seabird diving almost looks shiny underwater. It looks oily. And these little bubbles come out because as they dive, their feathers compress and some of that trapped air leaves their feathers. This is what insulates them. Interestingly enough, what kills birds when there's oil spills in the ocean isn't the oil itself being toxic. The toxicity of the oil can be fatal to birds and is fatal to birds, but the highest number of deaths comes from the oil getting on their feathers, gunking up their feathers, and then their feathers not working, and all of a sudden water touches their skin. In these seabirds, water never touches their skin. Their feathers are arranged like a dry suit that cover and protect them, that keep them warm. If the oil gets on there and gunks them up and just water touches their skin, birds die from hypothermia, and they die in minutes, right? Or under an hour. They'll be dead just from freezing to death all of a sudden. So that's the main effect of oil spills in the ocean. So it's not like you can get out there and like the oil's not going to kill them in a week or two. The oil's going to kill them in like 20 minutes. It's pretty gnarly. MERS, specialized divers, they can dive down to 600 feet deep and hold their breath for 3.5 minutes. So pretty amazing. Cormorants don't oil their feathers as much because they're larger birds. The oil will trapped air will make them more buoyant, and for them, that's a disadvantage for them. So they don't oil their feathers. They put their wings behind their backs. They use their big feet underwater. They're not as well adapted or as specialized as the MERS. And because of that, they have to dry their feathers. So they'll come up and then they'll spread their wings out and dry their feathers off. You'll see them doing that actually over by the Three Graces. Between Garibaldi and Rockaway, those rocks out in the ocean in the bay there, they're covered in these cormorants. You can see them out there. There's a group of close to 100 that roost on the rocks or in the trees around it. And many times you'll see them out there with their wings outstretched. Looking all biblical. Okay. So last here, we're going to talk about feeding adaptations to life at sea. There's about 6 main adaptations that seabirds have. We can divide them into 6 different groups, I guess, for how they get food in the ocean, and this is pretty cool. So when we talk about seabirds, we'll talk about wing or foot-propelled underwater swimmers. Penguins, of course, fall into this, where they use their feet and wings, and they propel themselves underwater to swim. But the other group in our area is the MERS and the puffins. The auklets are the best at this. And the MERS, puffins, and auklets sit on the surface and they just turn and dive underneath using their wings to push them, much like you would in a pool. Once they're under there, they use their feet and wings to push. Cormorants don't use their wings underwater. They put them behind their back. So when they go to dive, they kind of raise up and lunge. And even at a distance, even at a mile away, just from the motion of how a bird dives, I can tell if it's a cormorant or an auk right away, because cormorants have this high arching neck when they dive. And again, they use their feet and hold their wings to their side. These birds dive from the water surface. They don't plunge from the air. They're sitting on the surface. They turn and dive. The heavier the bird is, the faster they are underwater. So being a big, heavy bird is good in this case. This is what makes them crappy flyers. They have solid bones, and they're faster because they're not as buoyant. So they got to be fast because they got to catch agile fish. If you ever tried to catch a fish with your hand while swimming in the water, well, you've never actually caught a fish with your hand. Plungers. So these are birds that dive from the air, circle around, wait till they see something, and then drop straight down into the water and snatch it. In our area, it would be terns, those birds that are related to the gulls. Gulls and terns both do this. Terns specialize in it. And in the south of us, in the more tropical areas, the subtropics, you have gannets. They're also called boobies. And these birds will drop from on high, but they're big birds and they're very arrow-shaped, and they just and they'll plunge several meters underwater, and then they'll kind of use their feet and wings a little bit, kind of clumsily underwater to hold themselves while they grab at bait fish. And they'll do it in big groups, so they'll kind of corral the fish into one cluster by doing this, and it's pretty amazing to watch. I have in blue here, these are hyperlinks that'll take you to videos that I have linked of MERS, puffins underwater, of gannets diving. I encourage you to watch those. They're really cool and fascinating. So click on those and go right there. The presentation is also linked in Google Classroom. Okay. Feeding, got a few more here. Surface seizing. So we talked about this with albatross. They'll fly along for days or weeks until they see food on the surface of the ocean. They'll drop down and then they'll grab it. And that could be something deceased, like bits of a whale or a seal, anything, a jellyfish. And because of this, these birds are incredibly susceptible to something we put in the ocean that floats, because it looks like food to them. Plastic. These birds eat plastic in huge numbers. Cigarette, disposable cigarette lighters, toothbrushes, kids' toys, cups, bits of plastic also. So this was fractured microplastics and plastic bags. Albatross are really hit hard by this, and I'm going to post a video later that talks about this and the effect on the largest bird in the world and what we're doing there. They'll also feed on plankton and crustacean and things like that, pteropods. So now we're thinking of things like squids and other things like that as well that come up to the surface in the night and twilight hours, and they'll scavenge on dead or sick or dying animals. Phalaropes have a really neat one for being on the surface and just grabbing what's there. These little birds here, they're in a weird group of seabirds. Red-necked phalarope, that's what this one is. We also have a red phalarope. They will swim in little tiny circles, like a little weird little wind-up toy. And that spinning motion creates a vortex that sucks up plankton to the surface. So they kind of create a whirlpool. And then while they're spinning in the circle, they put their head, they lean into the middle of that circle with their bill and pick out the plankton that's being sucked up. Really cool strategy. Okay, flight dipping is flying along and snatching stuff while you're in flight there. So feed on small fish and plankton while flying over the surface. And the best example of this are the skimmers. So you don't actually stop on the surface of the water. You just grab stuff as you go. The black skimmer is related to gulls and terns. You can see some resemblances there. And it has the only bird in the world with a longer lower mandible. The lower bill is longer than the upper bill, so it sticks out further. So as they cruise along, that lower bill is going through the water, and then they catch something, they flip it up, and then they grab it. A fish and stuff. Kind of cool. I worked with these in Louisiana, saw many of them. They're down in the Gulf. And these birds were really affected by the oil spill. I think you can see exactly why by just that photo right there. Add oil to that. Okay, not good. Another example of flight dipping, specialized form of it, is called patterning. And it's what the storm petrels do, where they literally walk along the surface of the ocean while flapping. They're so light, and their feet are, spread out, and then their wings that they use the surface tension of the water, kind of fly walk across it and feed on zooplankton. 2 more, and we're done. All right. Feeding strategies. Pirating is one. So now you're stealing. And this is a feeding strategy that is employed by several different groups of birds. A fancy name for that would be kleptoparasitism. So when we're talking about biotic interactions, living things interacting with each other, predation is one. Predation, consumerism is one of those where you kill and eat something. Competition is another category. You're competing with something for a resource. And then there's symbiosis, where 2 things work together, basically. Now, in this case, parasitism is a form of symbiosis. It's not predation. This bird is not eating this bird. This bird is the predator that killed this thing. And this bird is stealing that thing from this bird. Now, how is that cooperation? Well, this bird is an unwilling cooperative, basically. This bird is gaining, this bird is losing, but this bird is not losing its life. So therefore, it's not predation. Kind of weird. This bird's the predator of this, and this is the parasite on this. And make it fancy by calling it kleptoparasitism. Now I'm a parasite by virtue of thievery. These birds steal food from other birds. In the tropics, the frigate bird is the quintessential kind of predator parasite bird. These birds will bomb other birds, bringing food back in their bills constantly and steal. If another bird is feeding down in here, the frigate bird won't bother getting the food off the water. It'll come down and just kick the other bird in the face and steal its food. Up north here, we have these birds called Jaegers. They're related to gulls. It's the grayish bird here. They got these 2 distinct, the parasitic Jaeger has 2 distinct tail feathers that stick down here. I have seen these in Alaska and worked with them. They make a cool mewing sound. And I put a link here to a video of one so you can see them in action. They will come at like 100 miles an hour from the sky above as this bird is cruising along thinking life is good, and just kick it right in the back of the head at full speed, making this bird drop its food. Oftentimes the gulls and other things will just drop their food when they see a Jaeger coming because they know pain is on the way. Pretty fun to watch, actually. Okay, they harass smaller birds until they drop their food. They'll actually, parasitic birds will also harass another bird until it pukes, which is gross because they don't eat the bird, they eat the puke of the bird. I've seen that happen. Okay, last one. Whales. Some birds actually will specialize in following whales. Whales will drive food to the surface, so whales will work cooperatively, especially humpbacks. to drive bait fish up to the surface, because then the bait fish have nowhere else to go once they get to the top. And so they kind of fence them in. Birds will take advantage of that, and birds will time their movements and even migrate with the whales as feeding partners, taking advantage of that. It's almost that is another form of symbiosis. Might be symbiotic in that the birds might drive the fish back down towards the whales. It might just be commensal in that the birds are gaining while the whales really don't really care. With gray whales that migrate up and down our coast, gray whales are a bottom feeder. They'll dive to the bottom, suck up mud, come to the surface, kind of blow that mud out through their baleen, and then what's left in the baleen is the bits, the good bits, the worms, the crustaceans, the mollusks from the sediment, and then the whales will eat those. The birds will often gather around, gulls especially will follow whales as they're feeding and take advantage of that. Few pictures from Alaska. This is an area called Unimak Pass. It's right where the Alaska Peninsula gives way to the Aleutian Islands. And this is the first place where the Bering Sea kind of waters mix with the Pacific Ocean down below it. And there's a huge current that runs through there, a great mixing of these two bodies of water. The Aleutian Trench is right off of there, a very deep ocean trench. So you get upwelling along that, and just huge mixing currents. Tons of nutrients are brought to the surface. And in the springtime and summertime, the amount of light and the plankton bloom here is phenomenal. And the amount of zooplankton in the water is phenomenal. And these groups of shearwaters, the type of tube nose from the southern hemisphere, show up in the millions to feed on the surface. So you can just look at this photo and just think about how much life is in there in the water to support this many birds feeding. It is bananas. I've been lucky enough to take a boat through there when working in Alaska, and we stopped, and the boat never stops. And the captain of the boat stopped the boat, and we went up, everybody in the boat went up on the top deck of the boat, the flying bridge, and just stood there. And it was like this. There were fin whales, which are related to blue whales. There were humpback whales. There were birds horizon to horizon, and it was just this loud, amazing feast of nature like I've never seen before. So cool stuff. Seabirds are amazing. They have so many cool adaptations, and they're out there. We often don't appreciate them. Here in Oregon, if you want to see them, your Quinn Head Lighthouse, just south of us in Newport, is a great place to go out, and you can see murres right offshore there. Bring some binoculars with you. Often you might be even lucky enough to see some puffins and things like that. If you hike out to Cape Lookout, that's a good spot to look down in the water from there. You'll see groups of seabirds. You'll see murres down in there. You'll see guillemots. And then if you go out to Cape Meares, you'll see cormorants nesting on the cliffs right there. You'll also see murres out in the water and down on the cliff and the rocks below. So that's a really neat and great spot to see these birds. You usually start seeing them in the spring, and then peak in probably May and June. Here, I've worked with them in Alaska, so the times are a little different up there. Our peaks when it starts showing up in June, and then July is just bananas. Okay, take a look at the links that I've posted in here and hyperlinked in here. Weekly questions, read the chapter, and I'll probably post a video on albatross later. That's it. Sapora out.